right, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kerry Holliday, and I'm one of the Senior Donation Consultants with Give Life Alberta. I'm also a member of the ATI Education Planning Committee, and I'm really pleased to share an exciting presentation with you today. Before we begin, I'd like to just take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Thank you to Paladin for their support of the ATI seminar series. Before I introduce our speaker, just want to let everyone know of our format for today. We are going to have the hour, and you are welcome at any time to put your questions in the chat window. We'll have some time reserved at the end for questions, and look forward to today's session. So our seminar is on mandated anonymity in deceased organ donation, a time for change. And I'd like to welcome Nicholas Murphy. He's a postdoctoral fellow in bioethics with the Departments of Medicine and Philosophy at Western University. His work explores ethical issues at the intersection of organ donation and transplantation, critical care, and research with human participants. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here. It's great to see such a nice turnout, and I recognize a lot of names in the audience. So good to see everybody there. I'm just going to share screen now.
Yep, looks good.
Looks good?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to start by just quickly mentioning that I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I'm certainly not qualified to discuss any off-label uses of drugs or devices, so I can promise you I won't be doing that in this talk. I'm going to be talking about the policy of mandated anonymity in deceased organ donation and why it's time that we rethink this policy so that we can better support and protect deceased donors, family members, and organ recipients. By way of background, currently legislation or policy in places like Ontario prevents organ donation organizations such as Ontario's Trillium Gift of Life Network from disclosing the identities of donor families and organ recipients to one another. And I'm going to make the case in this talk that that legislation needs to change to allow organ donation organizations to develop policy that responsibly mediates direct contact between deceased donors' families and organ recipients if both sides want it. Before I get into that, I want to draw your attention to part of what motivated us to write the article that this talk is based on. So what you see here is a screenshot from a Facebook group based out of the US called Donor Families and Recipients of Organ and Tissue Transplants. In the screenshot, you can see it has about 7,000 members, but I checked more recently and now it's up to about 8,500 members. If you take a look at the description of the group, you can see that it's designed to help deceased donors' families and the recipients of their loved ones' organs find each other. It's described as a closed group created for people looking for people associated with organ donations and transplants in the US. And this group is a good example of the many groups like it you can find online. Here's another one based out of Canada called Canadian Transplant Recipients and Organ Donor Families Seeking Each Other. This is a group created by a mother whose son passed away and donated his organs, saving and improving the lives of several people in the process. Last I checked, this one was up to over 1,000 members. Here again, if you take a look at the description, you can see that the sole purpose of the group is to connect deceased donors' families and organ recipients. The creator notes that privacy laws in Canada prevent the disclosure of people's identities, even if both sides agree. And interestingly, she notes that healthcare providers told her that donor families and recipients are increasingly seeking each other online. There are lots of other groups like this. Not all of them are dedicated just to connecting families and recipients. There are others like this one that function as support groups and discussion boards or information exchange forums. But even in these ones, you'll often find pleas for information from interested parties. Here's a typical one from a mother whose daughter received a liver transplant. She offers a bit of information about the transplant and then says, if you or your loved one could possibly have been her donor, I would love to hear from you. Now, we don't have data on how widespread this kind of thing is or how many donor families and organ recipients manage to connect in this way, but we do know it's happening. And we know it's probably only going to happen more in the future as more and more people learn about these groups, more groups start up, and as they become more sophisticated. So let's ask why it's happening. So first, it's happening because many stakeholders clearly believe that they can benefit from getting to know the people on the other side of their story. Second, as I mentioned earlier, it's happening because many jurisdictions, in fact, most jurisdictions worldwide, there's policy or legislation that explicitly forbids identity disclosure, meaning that organ donation organizations are prevented from sharing the identities of deceased donors, family members, and organ recipients, even when both sides want it. So this is why people are taking to social media as a recourse. I do want to talk about the benefits that can be realized when the two sides meet, but first I want to go into some history on the rationale for these restrictive policies, because it is important to acknowledge that there are some very good reasons behind it. You may be surprised to learn that in the 60s and 70s, healthcare providers working in the donation and transplantation communities did believe that donor families and organ recipients had a right to know one another's identities, particularly because it was thought that getting to know each other could enhance meaning for both sides. But then healthcare providers began to realize that there could be some potential drawbacks to allowing direct contact and that stakeholders were sometimes experiencing unanticipated harms. For example, if an organ recipient died, the families who got to know them could experience a secondary loss, feeling like they'd lost their loved one all over again. Sometimes the two sides could have differing expectations about the relationship, which could lead to emotional distress. Recipients could also potentially experience unwelcome feelings of indebtedness, or they could sometimes feel an increased sense of guilt in knowing that someone had to die for them to receive an organ. They might also be drawn into the family's mourning, which could complicate their recovery. And there was some concern that donor families in some cases could potentially put pressure on recipients to live a lifestyle that they believed honored their loved one's gift of life. In the worst case, it was feared that emotional manipulation or financial exploitation could occur. While evidence for these harms was initially entirely anecdotal, more recent qualitative research out of jurisdictions where identity disclosure is allowed, such as in Israel and some centers in the US, has found that at least some of them can indeed occur. So it's risks like those that were the reason jurisdictions around the world decided to foreclose the possibility of any harms arising by mandating strict policies of anonymity in organ donation. Now, sometimes they did this through legislation, as in Ontario, and sometimes they just did it through policy, as historically in British Columbia. The well-intended policies were meant basically to protect stakeholders who were perceived to be especially vulnerable due to their experiences with donation and transplantation. And for the most part, it's been that way ever since. So take a look at this clause in Ontario's enabling donation legislation as an example. No person shall disclose or give to any other person any information or document whereby the identity of any person may become known publicly. In practice, historically, this legislation meant that if donor families and recipients wanted to contact each other, they had to do so by exchanging letters that are mediated and anonymized by organ donation organizations, such as in Ontario, Trillium Gift of Life Network. If you look through some of the public Facebook groups I mentioned earlier, you can see that there's a lot of frustration among interested parties over this restrictive policy. What's really clear is that for some donor families and for some organ recipients, getting to know the people on the other side of their story is highly desirable. Why might that be? Well, again, we have some qualitative research to show that both sides can benefit from getting to know each other. For donor families, they're often able to find meaning in their loss. They're able to find some peace and closure or complete the donor's biography. They can see the legacy of their loved one's donation in a more tangible form. And they're often reassured by meeting a recipient that donation was the right decision, which can help to resolve grief. And many seem to benefit just from knowing a little bit more about the recipient. For recipients, the big benefit seems to be this chance to express their gratitude in a personal way for what many understand to be a gift of life. Expressing gratitude like this can help them honor the way that organ donation is often portrayed by the media, by organ donation organizations, and in the names of specific pieces of legislation as a gift or a gift of life. There is some criticism of this way of framing organ donation as a gift. The worry is that in encouraging people to understand donation as a gift, you might likewise be encouraging them to associate organ donation as calling for those customary cultural practices that come with gift giving as we understand it more generally. When you're given a gift, for example, you're expected to say thank you. But what happens when you're unable to say thank you for that gift or to demonstrate how thankful you are in a way that you understand to be meaningful? We know from qualitative research that I'll discuss a bit later that it can be very, very difficult for organ recipients to deal with this. So whether or not understanding donation as a gift is really the best way to characterize it, the fact is that we're saturated with that language in the donation world. Many people understand donation as a gift, and it seems like the opportunity to express that gratitude is very valuable to many recipients. The evidence suggests that saying thank you in a personalized way can help to relieve guilt, anxiety, and distress. And recipients also benefit from supporting the donor's legacy. And there's also a little bit of evidence to show that it can help with recovery. What's really interesting is that you can often find spontaneous expressions on Facebook groups that seem to corroborate these research findings. So take a look at this post, for example. This is from a woman who connected in person with a family member of a donor from whom she received a heart. She talks about their experience getting to know one another, notes that the experience changed her life, and emphasizes her belief that she and the family member now share an unbreakable bond. These sentiments were definitely shared by the donor family and recipient partners I worked with on this paper, or the paper that this talk is based on. Many of you may know them. So Kim LeBlanc lost her son Tyler in 2011, and Dave Allingham was the recipient of Tyler's heart. About a year later, with the help of social media, Kim and Dave met in person. Both have described the experience as profoundly healing. It's brought Kim a sense of closure, and Dave describes the opportunity to express his gratitude in person as an important aspect of his journey to recovery. Kim and Dave's families now keep in regular touch. Kim and Dave have done a lot of work in organ donation advocacy over the years. This past summer, Kim and her family even attended Dave's wedding in Italy, which I think is a great testament to the relationship they've built. Okay, so we know there are risks to direct contact, and we know there can be benefits. Now I want to get into why I think it's time to rethink the current regime of mandated anonymity. And I'm going to focus on just two arguments. The first is a moral argument, and the second is a more pragmatic argument. First, the moral argument. We know from qualitative research that deceased donors' families have been frustrated for a very long time by the apparent paternalism of donation and transplantation legislation and policy in this area. The basic idea is that if they're understood to be competent to provide surrogate consent for organ donation, why on earth do we think they're incapable of deciding whether to meet consenting recipients? So basically, the argument is, why the paternalism? Organ recipients voice a similar frustration with a restrictive policy that forces them to make depersonalized expressions of gratitude. Take a look at these quotes from a qualitative interview study of heart recipients in the US who were obliged by the existing restrictive policy to express their gratitude in depersonalized letters. One recipient says, "I don't know how to say thank you without being personal, so I haven't done that." Another participant says, "I just don't know where to go with it. I don't know how to do it properly." Here, I think it's interesting and worth noting that some of the anguish expressed by these heart transplant recipients or from donor families comes about as a result of the restrictive policies we're talking about. So, for example, the feelings of indebtedness on the part of transplant recipients can actually be exacerbated by the inability to express gratitude in that personal way. And the desire for closure that many donor families need can actually be frustrated by restrictive policies rather than encouraged by them. So the restrictive policies, in short, that are meant to protect people are actually sometimes causing harm. So the argument here is autonomy-based. In the donation and transplant context, donor families and surrogate decision makers are understood to be competent to make major decisions about consent to organ donation. Transplant recipients are understood to be competent to consent to major surgery. If they can make these momentous decisions, why do we think that they're incapable of deciding for themselves whether they might benefit from getting to know the other side if both sides are on board? In short, competent adults should have the right to decide for themselves. This argument admittedly is not new. It's been percolating in the donation and transplantation world for a long time. Certainly some jurisdictions were moved by it, and others are seemingly starting to rethink their policies in response. So Israel and some centers in the US have been mediating direct contact for decades. The UK now has a mechanism for this. There's movement in places like Italy and Australia to open things up. More notable, in Canada, we now see 3 provinces that have established mechanisms for identity disclosure. So Alberta was the first, and we have BC, and most recently, that is Nova Scotia. And I have heard, though I can't confirm, that Quebec is contemplating moving this in this direction. But the truth is that the moral argument has, for the most part, not been enough to stimulate a change in policy. I think the prevailing view has been that while the moral argument is somewhat persuasive, it's not really enough to justify changing policy or legislation because, things seem to be working fine despite the frustration of some people, and it's best not to rock the boat. So I want to bring us around now to the pragmatic argument for rethinking mandated anonymity, and that'll bring us back to social media. So as I mentioned at the outset of the talk, in those places where restrictive policies are in place, people are taking to social media to find each other. And I want to take a minute now to look a little more closely to see exactly how they're doing it. So earlier we saw this post in which someone sought to identify a recipient by providing, a donor, by providing some details of the transplant in the hopes that someone would recognize the details. And that's typical of what you see online. However, there are other more sophisticated ways than this. For example, this is a post from a woman who not only shares the details of a donation, she also shares the anonymized letters she received through Trillium Gift of Life Network in the hopes that a recipient will recognize their letter. I have blocked out the letters, but I can assure you they're quite moving. The person writes, "Here are the actual letters we have received as a family, and hopefully someone out there will recognize their letter and be able to get in touch with us." Even more sophisticated is the strategy used by the groups dedicated to connecting people in Canada and the US that I showed at the very outset. So in those groups, people are encouraged to enter all details into two spreadsheets, and by cross-checking, users or administrators can identify likely donor family and recipient pairs and put them in contact. I know that there's a large database of this kind in Belgium and Australia as well. So people are finding each other. We know that, and we know that they think they can benefit. But really important to keep in mind for the pragmatic argument is that people are perhaps not aware that they're also unwittingly exposing themselves to the risks that we talked about earlier. This is a post from a person whose son donated his heart to a man who she recently learned is not doing well. This person had not yet even met this recipient, and yet they do seem to be experiencing a kind of secondary loss that would likely only have been aggravated had she met him, saying, "It hit me as if my son was dying all over again." So the pragmatic argument is this: the rise of social media is gradually making restrictive policies obsolete. People now can and do find each other, and when they do, they may benefit, but they're exposing themselves to risks and there's nobody there to support them. This is why I think it's time to address the risks of the new reality on social media, because right now it's just a wild west. And the point is that the concerns that once spoke to the need for restrictive policies now speak instead to the need for responsible oversight. By no means were we saying in the paper that there should be an end to gatekeeping entirely. Mutual identity disclosure is definitely not for everyone. It's probably not for most. And anonymity is, of course, still a right for those who want it. What we are saying is that there needs to be responsible policy in place to help protect and support people, excuse me, whether they want to meet or not. The irony is that in places like Ontario, the very legislation designed to protect stakeholders is now a barrier to developing policy that can protect and support them in the age of social media. Organ donation organizations can't really do anything to mediate contact without breaking the law. And that's why we called for change to allow organ donation organizations to develop policy for mediating direct contact for those who want it, and for helping to protect the anonymity of those who don't. What do people think about this in Canada? Well, attitudes toward letting donor families and recipients meet are mixed. A survey of members of the Canadian Society of Transplantation from 2015 found that when asked whether organ recipients and donor families should be allowed to meet, 53% of respondents said yes, 27% said no, and 20% neither agreed nor disagreed. When asked about the implications of social media for mandated anonymity, almost 40% did feel that a reexamination of current policies was necessary. Unfortunately, this is the most recent data we have. This is from 10 years ago. We don't know where things stand now. I do think it's notable that, as I mentioned, 3 provinces have changed their policies relatively recently: BC, Alberta, and Nova Scotia. So there does seem to be some momentum toward change. But whatever the current level of support, we think there's no option but to face up to the new realities here. We need to explore viable alternatives to the current regime. What would revamped policies look like? In short, I don't have the answers for this. We certainly didn't have a fully developed policy in mind when we wrote the paper, but strategies from other jurisdictions are instructive, and there have been some very useful studies exploring ways to facilitate direct contact in a way that confers benefit on both sides while still mitigating the risks involved. For example, some research has shown that when both sides meet, having a mediator there can be helpful for managing expectations and helping to deal with any unforeseen challenges. In some jurisdictions, these would be donation and transplant coordinators who already know the family, or the recipient who have dealt with them in the past. Research also suggests that a so-called cooling off period is a good idea to allow families to process and for recipients to recover. As well, it can be helpful if before identity disclosure, the two sides agree on expectations for the relationship to avert any disappointment. And pre-counseling, for example, with social workers is helpful for making sure that the two parties are adequately prepared and in the right state of mind before identity disclosure. For those donor families and recipients who do not want to meet, having resources available that give guidance on how to protect identity when using social media is or has been found to be useful for maintaining anonymity. There are, however, some challenges that need to be explored that I haven't seen addressed in the literature in any detail. The first of these has come up when I've discussed this with people in the past. It concerns organ donation organization liability. So currently, since most organ donation organizations don't play any role in introducing donor families and recipients, they of course can't be held liable for any adverse outcomes that might arise out of these meetings. But if they did facilitate meetings, could they then be held liable for any reason if a relationship were to go awry? This question might have different answers depending on the legal frameworks in different jurisdictions. It's the sort of worry that may give organ donation organization decision makers some pause. So thinking through it a little more with some legal minds would be important. The second challenge is a familiar one, namely who's going to pay for this? What resources will be needed? Where will funding come from? Are we going to need social workers? Are we going to need psychologists? Are they new hires or is it new duties for existing staff? I think that there's a good case to be made that finding the resources for this would be in the interest of organ donation organizations. But the fact is that the healthcare sector is struggling, and this may be an added cost that policymakers would hope to avoid for budgetary reasons. Another issue here that's kind of tricky is what should happen when donor family members disagree with each other over whether to disclose the donor's identity. So who should have the right to decide? Would it be the surrogate decision maker? If not, would there need to be some kind of family consensus? And if consensus, then how would that be assessed? Should any member of the family have a kind of veto power? And if so, how exactly would that work? The privacy interests of different parties need to be carefully balanced in scenarios where there's disagreement. But how to do that, I think, needs some further thinking. A fourth possible concern is who's going to be responsible for assessing whether the two parties are in the right frame of mind for mutual identity disclosure. I can imagine cases where the person tasked with connecting donor families and recipients judges that identity disclosure would be bad, at least at that time, for one of the parties due to the state of mind of one party or the other. So that would put them in a difficult position. So how would they balance autonomy considerations with the duty to avoid harm? Who should make those decisions and on what grounds? So this is a scenario that any policy should have contingency plans for ahead of time. Finally, there's the question of whether the mere fact that donor family and recipient contact policies have been liberalized will change expectations. In cases where one party wants contact and the other doesn't, for example, will this exacerbate the frustrations that we already see on Facebook groups? Will recipients feel an added responsibility to make contact or an added sense of burden? At this point, and in the absence of any research on this, it is difficult to know. I do think that there are probably good answers to these challenges and solutions that can be explored, but it is important to acknowledge that changing policy in places like Ontario might not be that easy. There are jurisdictions, though, that we can look to for guidance. It'll be interesting, for example, to see how Nova Scotia's new policy is playing out. So there, the entire process is contingent on both sides wanting it. Unless both sides independently and spontaneously express interest in identity disclosure, it can't happen. Stakeholders have to wait at least 12 months before the disclosure, and during that period, there should be some anonymous letter exchange. After that, both parties go through a consent process in which they're told about the risks involved, and then they're asked to sign a consent and release form. I'd be interested to hear more about Alberta's policy here, and I know that BC's policy is quite similar to the Nova Scotia one. There are other jurisdictions with a much longer experience with this that we could look to. In Israel, for example, initial meetings are mediated by donation and transplant coordinators. There's some interesting research that's emerged from there that we could look to. Surveys have found an overwhelming majority of parties who make direct contact do derive benefit, so it would be useful to learn more about processes and safeguards in jurisdictions where they've been doing this for a long time. Another potential model could be that which is used in some places for donor-conceived people or adoption. So in those models, stakeholders can register their preferences regarding information and identity disclosure and pursuing contact. And then an agency tailors professional support according to the party's needs and circumstances. So a system like that would be just one way of protecting anonymity for those who want it, while also respecting the attitudes and needs of people who don't want it. So what can we do now? I know you're already here in Alberta, but in the Ontario context at least, we certainly don't have a fully developed policy in mind, but we think that something should be done in the interest of donor families and recipients. So in places where it's needed, we're calling for legislative change to allow organ donation organizations to develop responsible policy for mediating and facilitating direct contact between donor families and recipients. We suggest in the paper that a working group should convene to explore the issue of mandated anonymity. Of course, in this group, you'd want to have healthcare providers who work in donation and transplantation, legal scholars, donor families and recipients, and ethicists. We envisioned a kind of stepwise approach where research into strategies in other jurisdictions comes before a policy is developed and tested, and all that would be coupled with a consultation and evaluation of the approach to see how it works and how it can be improved as we move along. Takeaway message for this presentation is that social media has really changed the game here, and we think it's time to face up to that. Whatever the ultimate parameters of less restrictive policies, a balanced approach to donor family and recipient contact would help to protect anonymity for those who want it and responsibly facilitate contact for those who don't. I'll just take a quick minute here to thank my colleagues and supervisors who worked with me on this project, Charles Vare, Murat Slesarev, and Michael Ward, the Donor Family Aftercare Coordinator at Trillium Gift of Life Network. And a special thanks to Kim LeBlanc and Dave Allingham, our team's donor family and recipient partners, for their dedication and insight. I'd also be happy to share a list of useful references with anyone who's interested in learning more about this topic. Really eager to take your questions, but I'd also like to kind of think of this as a discussion to get your perspectives and just talk through it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's amazing how many different considerations there are when making change. And of course, change is always difficult. And from a healthcare provider perspective, we care so much about privacy and respecting people and protecting people's privacy. You know, I can see how making a shift takes time and encouragement. So I have a comment here from Sean. It says, as organ transplantation and donation is truly an interprovincial service involving sharing of organs, as well as out-of-province recipients listed on provincial waiting lists, it seems some type of minimum alignment across the country would be ideal to pursue in this space.
I'll just quickly comment on that, Sean. That's a great point. I think the inconsistency in policies across provinces leads to a special kind of added frustration for people who want to make direct contact when the organ or tissue crosses borders. So I know in Alberta, for example, facilitated identity disclosure can only be done if both the donor and the recipient are within Alberta. So I think that a harmonization of policies across provinces would not only be a good idea, it would also sort of serve to uphold the trust that people have in donation and transplantation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have Phil Holler in there. I think you were first. Go ahead.
Well, I really appreciate your talk, Nick, and I like this initiative. This has been an issue that goes way back to the 70s, and there are really two aspects. One is that Canada has no National Organ Transplant Act. Unlike most developed countries, we have no federal legislation governing our activities. This would be one area where thoughtful discussion. The process, we initiated this some time ago, but it ended up going nowhere. It would be an act of Parliament, which could then lead to could be tabled and go into committees, and a lot of these issues could be discussed before reaching a final federal act, which would help guide us in a number of ways. But I think the other thing is, in the absence of a federal act, there's something you may not have considered, and that is that organ transplantation as an activity is very, very vulnerable to adverse publicity. So there's not just the risk for individuals, but there's the risk to the whole field. And I've lived through times when an adverse effect, and watch this in other countries, a bad behavior by one person, one surgeon in Germany caused enormous harm. Adverse publicity at the national level in England, they went through a period of harm to the whole donation system. And so giving donation, a deceased organ donation, particularly a bad name, can hurt the entire field. And adverse effects where a person gets involved in extortion, for example, which I know is in the back of your mind, could really be something which we'd all regret, profoundly regret. Anyway, so when you're thinking about risks and benefits, first of all, I absolutely, and I think we always have, supported the idea that a moderated discussion between the two consenting parties would be ideal. But the issue of risk should also involve the possibility that this could go badly and it would not be able to be moderated. Not to say that it shouldn't happen. I think it should happen. I just think that that's an aspect which has always been in the back of our minds. Anyway, any comments about that?
Thank you very much for that comment. You know, it's something that I kind of tried to skip over a little bit in the presentation by honing in on these very sort of specific autonomy-based arguments and considering individual interests and family interests, of course, when in fact, we're talking about something that may happen within the context of a broader system with multiple stakeholders that's utterly reliant on public and healthcare provider trust for its success. So I completely agree. If anything goes wrong, it could be very bad. Negative media attention could be very bad arising from this. I think on balance, that might actually be an argument for the involvement of organ donation organizations, in that if we're on top of it and if we're responsibly mediating it and putting resources in place that could help to mitigate the chances of any adverse sort of outcomes from these meetings, and if there are resources available that parties can turn to if they're facing something as awful as exploitation of any kind, then I think it might actually be wise to stay on top of it. Of course, that's just one perspective, and it would need further study, but I'd be very interested to hear what the group thinks on that, particularly those in ODO leadership positions on the call.
A few of our leaders here, Mike or Deanna, if either of you want to chime in. And I'll just pause for a second, and then if not, we'll move to Janet there. Oh, there's Deanna. Thank you.
Deanna. Yes, good point about the exploitation. I think maybe I could back up a moment about our experience so far with it. We have had our law, I can't even remember now how long, and we did put in place very similar rules to Nova Scotia. There's a cooling off, and there has to be letters back and forth and so on. And we did have a coordinator that was interacting with both sides independently. And good point about choosing if how they are doing emotionally, are they ready to meet? It is a lot to put on that person. And we have since changed over now and have supported the hiring of a social worker to be family follow-up. So we did recognize some of that and a challenge for a coordinator. We also recognize that the coordinators, being quite busy with their clinical work, did not really have a lot of time to devote to some of that kind of work. There isn't a lot of people coming forward, and what I know of it, it has been very positive. We have not had, to my knowledge, an incident where there has been like sort of outward exploitation, wanting money or whatever. We did have a little rocky start where we actually put the first people together face to face and did have a challenging time. So when you're talking about the risks, one of the parties of the two had difficulty. So we stopped that and we changed to starting with Zoom calls, and so we sort of changed the process of how the parties got together. And then at a certain point we back out, and it's up to them if they want to continue or not. There's no obligation, but there's lots of food for thought today about how long you might monitor. We are in contact with a lot of the families, and definitely with the recipients, on the recipient side anyway. So there's definitely some food for thought today of some other things that we could certainly look at. So thanks for that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting.
Thanks, Deanna. And we'll move over to you, Janet. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Kerry, and thank you, Nick, and the team behind you for your presentation. I thought I would just speak about Ontario a bit, since we've been mentioned a number of times. I think on a number of things. One, in Ontario, as you mentioned, Nick, it's not policy for us, it's legislation that has to change. At Trillium, we are supportive of changing the legislation in this area. We have had legislative change in front of government for a number of years. For us, we're not looking to make just one change in our legislation. However, we're looking to make a number of changes simply because the practice of donation has changed over the years, and our legislation is over 20 years old. So for us, it would be a big rewrite. And as I have been reminded over the years, while we're committed to that rewrite, we have to remember that when we open up the legislation, we lose control of it too, right? The governments and the lawyers of the day decide what's going to be written. And so for Ontario, that's a very important. We've had very strong legislation over the years. We do not want to see it weakened in any way. And so it's just that caution to, I think all of us who have had legislative change know that once it opens, we lose control of it into some regards, or can lose control of it, because it's not our pens that are on the paper. So it's just remembering that. I think the comment about, and Deanna spoke to it well, the ODOs have to be involved. We're the ones that are going to make this, we're going to have to operationalize any of this legislative change. And legislative change does not always come with funding. And to the point that Phil made around the trust in the donation system, very, very important, as we all know. And so we don't want legislation that we can't support and operationalize well. And so I think it's a good point that we all make sure that we tie those two together when we're talking about policy or legislative changes. And then the other thing I would just mention is we're very focused always on organ donation and organ donors and organ recipients. But in Ontario, we have thousands of tissue recipients as well, where a recipient isn't necessarily known. And so we just need to be thoughtful about what we would do and what that legislation would look like for a very large number of people. I'll just give you a sense in Ontario, if the highest in a year that we've done of organ donors, I think was 393 organ donors. We've done over 2,400 tissue donors in a year. So that's a lot of donor families there as well. And so I think we just need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about legislative or policy changes. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for that comment. I have to admit, it never occurred to me that I never thought seriously about this idea of once you open the legislation, anything can happen. You might be shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak. And that's a very important point that I want to thank you for raising it. I need to think about that. I suppose in Ontario, in some ways, we have the benefit of being able to learn from other provinces. Should the legislation ever be opened, I have heard from BC and Alberta that the numbers are, to my mind, surprisingly low, considering sort of some of the surveys I've seen from other jurisdictions about how many people want this and everything. So, we might know more about like what potential costs could be and things like that in future. So thank you for raising those points. Yeah, I'll have to think more about it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Briefly add to that, and Deanna, correct me if I'm wrong. Our legislation doesn't actually comment on this piece of work. It's our ODO and organizational policies. Is that correct?
That is a good question.
I don't
where.
believe it's actually in our legislation,
Oh,
but
okay.
it's just in our organizational policies, which does give us a little more ability to change as something in the environment of this world changes, right? It's a little bit easier. So.
Yeah, my understanding is that BC and Alberta, the language was sufficiently vague or non-specific that there was room to do this at the policy level, which of course helps avoid the problem of potentially opening up the legislation itself. Yeah, so good to keep in mind.
All right, and we'll move over to Jordy, and then we have a question in the chat from Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Jordy. I'm from BC Transplant. Run the family services program here. So we've been doing this work since, I guess, 2019. And yeah, our legislation, as Nick said, was sufficiently vague that it allowed us to shift policy. And I think it is important to acknowledge that the policy change was really driven by like self-advocacy from recipients and donor families over years to BC Transplant. So we were fortunate in that we were able to respond to that. I think like some other folks spoke to this a little bit, but I just want to echo it, that I think a huge problem nationally that continues to exist but is getting better all the time is that from a family services perspective and donor family support perspective, ODOs have operated really in isolation from each other, and there's kind of a widely different availability of resources to do this work across the country, and that has, I think, presented and continues to present a challenge. So I'd love for some sort of like national body like CBS or something to take up this, not just direct contact between donor families and recipients, but donor family support in general, as a piece of work to kind of standardize or advocate for. I think that every ODO should have like psychosocial support, a dedicated person to do that, because as I think Deanna mentioned before, it's beyond both the human resources capacity and the scope of practice of a donation coordinator to be doing this work, I would argue. And I also just wanted to speak to what I hear from donor families and transplant recipients about this issue of risk and like the potential for exploitation and all of that. I've found that by and large, this is an issue that ODOs and the healthcare system has largely projected onto donor families and transplant recipients. I think that it's like very important to consider the risks, but in my counseling with donor families and transplant recipients preparing for sharing contact information or meeting, they part of the reason why they're doing this is because they feel comfortable in their own ability to manage risk in relationships in their own lives. And they appreciate now that there is a organization or a person that they can fall back on for extra support if needed, but largely they're trying to get away from the paternalism of the system. And most people I talk to are like, yeah, I feel confident that like, especially after some like counseling around it, that I can like independently manage this relationship just like I would manage any other relationship in my life through like communicating boundaries and etc. Right? So yeah, a plug the ability for like a little bit of extra support up front, really making it so people feel confident kind of fledging from the coop, you know?
Yeah, it's great to hear that. And yeah, I think that's really interesting and not surprising, honestly. I mean, the donor families and recipients I know are very strong people who have been through a lot, and those experiences change them, right? And maybe it helps prepare them for these kinds of relationships. I'll just quickly mention, I kind of along the lines of what you were saying, there's a really great paper out of BC where they interviewed donor families and recipients to ask them about, you know, what are your concerns about the risks and everything, and almost every participant said, basically, I'm concerned about exposing the other person to risks. You know, they're less concerned about managing it themselves. They're worried about the other person, which again I think speaks to the maturity, you know, the emotional intelligence of these the respondents. So, thanks.
Just, my own experience doing donor family aftercare, as a social worker when I was in Saskatchewan, I really echo, what Jordy has said, and that support, because it's so unique to this world that is such a small, when it comes to other experiences of bereavement or other experiences, with transplant, it's just such a specialized area. And so on that note, we have a comment or question here from Sarah in the chat. What do you think about those cases where there are early post-transplant complications and the graft is lost or the recipient cannot be saved? How can or will this be communicated to the donor families? I know we have some other clinical folks here, but I'll just add a bit of an anecdote there in that the entire kind of donation process is we're going to do our best to make this happen, but we can't ever make any guarantees. And our donor coordinators are certainly really good about communicating all of that to the families at the time of donation. And not because this does happen, and we have scenarios where we go to the operating room and hope that certain organs are going to be recovered and transplanted and then aren't, or we have logistical issues with recipients, and so we really try to emphasize that we will do our best to honor this gift and move forward with this gift, and preparing families that there are no guarantees and we can just sort of hope for the best. And in terms of if a patient has passed away, let's say within a few months post transplant, I myself can't speak to how that situation is handled, but I can certainly take that question back to our group and provide some context afterwards. Sarah, thank you.
Actually, Kerry, my question was very much related to Sarah's comment, which is really well stated. I think from the recipient side, I see my friend Donna online, I see Nancy online. We have wildly different transplant stories between the three of us, and including others. And I think from someone who's only had living donors and who ride every hospitalization with me, ride everything with me, I think from a deceased donor family perspective, I would just want to make sure that they were ready for whatever the story is now and what it becomes, because Donna, we've all lost transplant friends over the last 5 years. We all have comorbidities. Maybe they weren't expecting in their head that it was going to be an old bald guy with gray hair like myself. So I do like the idea of the cooling off period, the letters back and forth and things like that, so that you're prepared for whatever may come, both at the initial meeting and also if you're looking at this as a potential long-term relationship or things like that. It's not going to be an easy ride. It never is for a transplant patient. We're all immune compromised. We've all gone through a pandemic, and some of us didn't make it. So, is a donor family fully prepared for all of the what comes with opening that door?
Mm-hmm. Really helpful comments.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Murphy. Yeah.
Really helpful comments and questions. You're all recruited to my working group on this. So.
Well, with one minute left, and I don't see any hands up, I just want to express our sincere appreciation, Dr. Murphy, for coming and sharing with us here in Alberta. And we look forward to following this topic and seeing, what happens nationally and the changes that we see, and learning from each other and doing what we can to support both donor families and transplant recipients. So thank you so much for today. And as everyone can just take note, we did put in the chat some information about our next topic. So please join us on April 23rd for a seminar session featuring a number of my colleagues from Give Life Alberta, who are presenting on a year of progress as a part of our recognition of National Organ and Tissue Donation Awareness Week. Additionally, we are welcoming our special moderator, Bernie Boulay, who's the mother of Humboldt Broncos and organ donor, Logan Boulay. And you can see the registration link is provided there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Nick and Kerry. Awesome job.